Mouthwashing is a game created by Wrong Organ, starring the 5-person crew of the Tulpar on their 382-day transit. This is their story. Daisuke is the intern and newest member of the Tulpar. Their name is the Japanese word for great help. They're also seen wearing a flower-patterned shirt with palm trees, with the flowers sitting somewhere between the white and pink hibiscus, and the hibiscus coupled with palm trees make for a very clear Hawaiian connection. Looking into Hawaiian symbolism, we can find that the white hibiscus represents purity, innocence, and new beginnings, while the pink hibiscus represents love and friendship. Putting together both the name and flower culminates into a perfect description for Daisuke, the innocent new friend who wants to help. He looks up to Swansea a lot and would easily call him his best friend, and although I don't think he would admit it, Swansea would call him the same. To be honest though, Daisuke would probably call everyone he meets his best friend. We know he and Curly are buds. He had sweetener in his bed, and with only Curly having access to it, I like to imagine that on a regular basis, Daisuke probably asked for some. In fact, even in game, you can see this happening during the cake scene when we play as Curly. Couple that with the game of Sorry, where we learn that Daisuke almost always wins, with Anya saying he has some sort of crazy luck, and the fact that you can find a Game Boy with his stuff, Daisuke comes across as the kind, innocent intern who always wants to eat candy and play board games with his friends. Later, we can actually find Daisuke's ID card located next to the game of Sorry in the lounge. And speaking of the Sorry board game, it actually updates throughout the game, hinting at what's going on in the story, with the color of the pieces relating to the color of the crew members' names. Anya being blue, Jimmy green, Daisuke pink, and Swansea yellow. One noticeable part is when Anya locks herself in the med bay, where we see all of her pieces knocked over. One of her pieces surrounded by both Daisuke and Jimmy, representing them trying to get to her. Or when Daisuke's on the ground and we need to find disinfectant. If you go over, you can actually see that all of Daisuke's pieces and Anya's pieces are knocked down, with now Swansea next to Jimmy and Jimmy next to Daisuke. And the last one, when Jimmy's bringing Curly to the table, and we can see that the only remaining pieces standing are Jimmy's. Speaking of Curly, he actually mentions that the ship only supports 4 people and he should have complained more, but that technically means that they only have 4 bedrooms for 5 people, so someone had to share a room. Now there's no way of knowing who, but in my personal headcanon, I like to think it's probably Daisuke and Swansea. I can imagine Daisuke struggling to sleep on the floor, Swansea in the bed, deciding to swap with him, saying that he's only doing it because he can't get any sleep with him making a bunch of noise on the floor, but we all know the truth. When Jimmy is hallucinating about Daisuke, we can actually find Daisuke in the coffin when in developer mode. But not just that, Daisuke is actually in every single coffin in the graveyard scene, including this one that's slightly open, and you can even see his flower on the top, all while Swansea is chasing him. Swansea chasing Jimmy in the scene, representing him trying to protect Daisuke from Jimmy, mirroring the real world by not allowing him to suffer another moment because of Jimmy, not letting him bleed out to death. Swansea is the engineer of the ship and the mentor of Daisuke. His ID card can be found in the vending machine while he's dancing with the axe. He's sometimes also referred to as Big Swan by Curly, and we even see him carrying around a swan keychain with the sign "Where the f*** are my keys" around its neck. An item I don't think he would buy for himself, and since we know that Curly called him Big Swan, I like to think it was a gift from Curly. Also explaining the sign, Swansea feels like the type of person to be prone to losing his keys and saying on a few occasions, "Where the f*** are my keys?" Inspiring Curly to get him the keychain with the phrase on a big white swan, both representing the nickname Curly has for him, as well as helping them stick out more so he wouldn't lose his keys as easily. Swansea's name also translates to mouth of the river, and some have connected the mouth part to his drinking, but that ignores the river part, so here's another way of looking at it. Swansea's on sobriety, meaning he's dry, so he's more accurately the mouth of the dry river. And what do you call a dry river? The mouth of the wash. Mouthwash. And speaking of mouthwash, did you know that during the TV scene where you can see the commercial for Dragon's Breath, you can also see
Do you often find yourself wondering why they don't love you? And why you don't see your name in more YouTube videos? Then I have the solution for you. Becoming a member today. For only $4.99 a month, you gain access to behind the scenes content and extra videos, as well as your name in the video, like the following people. But wait, there's more. We have a special offer. Still want to support the channel? Well, guess what? For only 99 cents, you still can. Think you'll get nothing out of it? Think again. you'll get a badge and special emotes in the chat. Don't wait, order now. Press the join button to become a member today, or visit www.VorksBox.com. That's www.VorksBox.com. Thank you so much, and enjoy the video.
Looking at Swansea's desk, we can see a photo of a dog. Wrong Organ posted a Q&A on their Steam page that mentioned the idea of Swansea having a dog on the ship, but they decided against it. We can also see some tools, blueprints, and books with titles that seem fairly advanced, so we know at the very least he's a pretty good engineer. We can even see him teaching Daisuke, where we can see some of Daisuke's drawings in his book. You can tell that Swansea cares a lot about Daisuke, leaving sticky notes all over the shop to help him with his learning, and even setting up an Arduino board. We can actually find some of the sticky notes in Medbay as well, which is actually where we find Yimpy, which the Q&A also confirms that it'd be drawn by Daisuke, meaning it was probably a gift from Daisuke to Anya. However, the other sticky notes on the walls have a different handwriting, a little bit messier, kind of looks like a doctor's handwriting, making me believe that they're Anya's drawings and not Daisuke's. They're also often accompanied by flowers. I also like to personally think that Anya and Daisuke are good friends who just sometimes hang out and draw things together. Also, the Q&A said that Yimpy is a drawing of Jimmy, so it seems like they might have been poking a little fun at him. While we have them all here, let's talk about color theory. Swansea's name is yellow, Daisuke's is magenta, and Anya's is cyan, and there's this concept in color theory that 3 colors equally spaced out work well together. This is called a triad, a literal representation of how they all work well together. Also, notice how green isn't included. Speaking of Anya, we actually don't see a lot of her and Swansea interacting. We do see some in some promo art, as well as during the party scene where we can see them chatting with each other. Besides that, there's only one real scene where we see them really interacting, and that being in the cockpit, where it is implied and then subtly confirmed that Swansea knew about what Jimmy did, that being assaulting Anya. Simply put, we don't know what their plan was. Maybe they're thinking about waiting till rescue arrived to hopefully get him arrested, not wanting to rock the boat in fear of what he would do before they showed up. However, we just will never know. Just like how we don't know how Swansea met his end. However, I have a theory. The main element that we need to understand is that Swansea never attacked Jimmy, and I'll explain why. First of all, Swansea has no motive to do so. Right before we see Swansea charge Jimmy with the axe, he says he doesn't care anymore. He talks about how he's given up, and he just walks away from Jimmy. Then Jimmy gets the prompt to get the gun. Keep in mind, Swansea hasn't threatened Jimmy. All he's done is put Daisuke out of his suffering, but Jimmy doesn't see it like that. Instead, Jimmy gets the gun. And the moment Jimmy puts his hand on that gun, we hear Curly start laughing, and no matter how you left the door behind you, it will always be closed. At this point, Jimmy's hallucinating, set off by him holding the gun, and he starts to imagine what's going to happen if he walks out that room. It just doesn't make sense. Are we supposed to believe that after Swansea walked away from Jimmy, he just changed his mind, and instead of being very careful, he decides to just charge at him, the man holding a gun now, yelling his name? It's almost comical. And it isn't Swansea. He isn't a killer. But that's not how Jimmy sees him. I believe Jimmy started thinking about what he would do next, imagining himself going through the vents. Very realistic, unlike with Daisuke's hallucination. But he doesn't actually go in. That's why he doesn't get hurt, and why the vents don't have any of Daisuke's blood. He's just standing in medbay, holding the gun, imagining all of this. Then imagining barricading himself inside of the cockpit. Part of the reason why the gun in the inventory is hidden. It's all in his head, with the thought, my hands won't stop shaking, while he's just standing there, holding the gun. Finally, working himself up to step out of medbay, where we see Swansea. Sitting at the table in the same chair as the one in Jimmy's mind, with a bottle of mouthwash. But that doesn't work for Jimmy. Swansea should be chasing him. He must have overpowered him, tied him up. Yeah, that's what happened. It has to be. This is when Swansea gives his speech, which, if you line up with the real room, has a TV screen in the background, explaining the visuals during the final speech, his swan song. We can also see the axe impact at the center of the screen in between them, symbolizing the very event that separated the two. It was Swansea using that axe on Daisuke, using it on his ray of sunshine. Afterwards, getting inspired by seeing him in the chair, Jimmy sets up the birthday scene, leaving his mouthwash bottle untouched. This also explains why there's no blood in the utility room at the end of the game, something that the game has been very good about tracking. Jimmy's telling this story in his head, so that he's the hero, capturing the villain, when in truth, he was the coward hiding from responsibility. In his mind, Swansea is a murderer, and he'll be his next victim, choosing to lie to himself about Swansea's death. Anya is the ship's nurse. Her name has multiple origins, but the main one that people point to is the word mother in Hungarian. Looking at the other origins of the name, I actually think they also work as well. In Russian and Kurdish, it's a name that means grace and strength, respectively. With how I've seen people interpret her final moments and with everything that she's gone through, grace and strength feel like they work well with her. It's also a Nigerian name that translates to eye or sight. And on the game's OST cover, you can see very specifically Anya putting in a contact lens. There's something else I want to mention about the name, this time specifically the color. I know I mentioned before that she's a triad with both Swansea and Daisuke, but I also want to point out that her name color is also the same as Polly that you see at the end of the game, further connecting the two. And if you didn't know, Polly represents the baby. Also, the shade of cyan, it's a bit on the light side. Hard to say for sure, but it kind of looks a little bit like a baby blue color. During the party scene, Jimmy mentions that she's trying to get into med school, something that is expanded on in the Q&A. Quote, Anya has tried and failed to get into med school 8 times. She completed Pony Express's provided nursing classes to qualify her for position on the Tulpar, valid only on board Pony Express property and company jurisdiction, because she needed money so she can keep trying. She's been reading a lot of books about psychology while on the Tulpar though. You can actually find these books in the medbay, and taking a look at a few of the titles, you can tell they're fairly student-level stuff. But this all means a lot to her. Getting rejected 8 times and not letting that stop you takes some serious willpower. But that's not all that can be found in medbay. You can also find this potted plant here. Before the crash, you can see that it's in good condition. However, after the crash, it's been moved out of the way of the foam and it's starting to lose some leaves. Next time we see it is during the censoring effect, where we can see it's wilted. An observant player might be able to actually tell what's happened to Anya before the reveal. Also, it took me a bit, but I'm pretty sure the plant is the Euphorbia Geroldi, a relative to the Euphorbia milli. Euphorbia milli also going by the name Crown of Thorns, because it's believed to be the plant that was used to make the Crown of Thorns. However, this is the Euphorbia Geroldi, or the Thornless Crown of Thorns. Does this mean anything? I'm not sure. I thought it might be connected to the Steam description with the line, God is not watching, but I couldn't find anything conclusive. I'm curious to know what other people think. There could be something I missed, but for now, I'm thinking it was probably just picked because it's a pretty plant with some fairly low maintenance. Anya has a phrase that she says 2 times in the game. I have to believe that our worst moments don't make us monsters, Jim. I have to, even in his case. I always believe that our worst moments didn't define us, didn't make us beyond repair. When I first played the game and I read these lines, I read them as actions. But it doesn't say that. It says moments, which includes both your actions and your moments. When she's talking to Jimmy about how our worst moments don't make us monsters, even in his case, she's referring to Curly's actions of crashing the ship, but also another person, herself. It's made clearer in the second line. I always believed that our worst moments didn't define us, didn't make us beyond repair. Saying that this isn't her worst moment, far from it. I don't think she's hinting at some other thing she did. She's talking about her assault, her worst moment. That's how she's coping with all of this. By telling herself that she isn't defined by what Jimmy did to her, that she isn't beyond repair. Alright, it's probably time we talk about it. Some people didn't pick up on this, but to make it clear, Anya was assaulted by Jimmy. It's hinted at a few times in the game. The big moment is in the cockpit when she says she's pregnant. The way that scene is framed and set up, having her slumped over in this darkness, this scene alone was enough for me and my girlfriend to know what she meant. The other scene is the one where she's talking to Curly at night. However, that scene takes place before we learn about the pregnancy, and on a first playthrough, reads more like generic game dialogue. That scene on a replay just hits like a truck, and most of this game does. As of writing this, I have over 189 hours on Steam in this game, and I'm still finding new things to talk about. But she also mentions a few things, like the dead pixel and how it's always in the back of her mind, referring to Jimmy and what he did to her, or the time remaining in their trip, and how quickly she points out how many months they have left, and the sleeping quarters and how they don't have locks. That one in particular being pretty blunt. After the crash, we can see that everyone now shares a room, with all their beds in the main area. However, Anya's bed is the only one made, and the other beds have at least something next to them. Like Daisuke has a Game Boy, Jimmy's got a cup, Swansea's got mouthwash, but Anya's got nothing. And I don't think it's because she's always keeping it clean. I think she doesn't sleep in her bed, choosing to instead sleep in the medbay. Also, during the 0 days before the crash sequence when we're talking to her as Curly, she mentions to not let Jimmy enter this room. I think hinting to both the fact that she hid the gun in there and that she's planning on sleeping in there since that door has a lock, which also explains why she put the gun in there. That way she can monitor it and lock it and herself away from Jimmy. And she was right. I haven't said it yet, but the ID cards are all in Jimmy's head, and I believe represent how he sees a person. Daisuke's board games, Swansea's food, and Anya, located in the locker in the cockpit, is the gun. Currently not there, proving that he was planning on it. But Anya stopped him. I do wonder what she was planning. It seems like she might have been trying to get the gun open, but it's hard to say. Looking at the combination, it does have one of the numbers correct, but it's hard to say if that proves anything. Maybe she was trying to talk to Curly, trying to get it unlocked. I hope our final moments with Curly were peaceful. While Jimmy was running around making a spiked cocktail, she was just sitting down, talking with a friend. I think she saw the writing on the wall. Power was running out, food was dwindling, if they even had any left. Trapped with the person who assaulted her. Now leader of the ship. He was going more and more unhinged every single day. It was only a matter of time before he found the gun. She made up her mind. She wasn't going to let that monster make another decision for her. That was worse than death. Curly, the captain of the ship. His ID card can be found next to the cryopod. This might be a good time to point out that the ship, the Tulpar, is named after a winged horse, which does make sense given the company branding. But you can also find some screens around the ship that have some fun messages from the devs. Here is one example. Now, let's write something important. Have you ever considered how useful umbrellas are? They're fashionable, protect you from the rain, and can be pretty cute too. I wish I knew who invented them. Do you think they're famous? I could look it up, but I won't. You do it, if you want. I won't spoil the rest here, so I recommend checking it out. Also, don't do what I did and try to read off the cryopod. This took me hours, only for me to realize that the exact same text is in the cockpit, but without the blur. Alright, let's get back to Curly with some color theory. We have the triad of Anya, Daisuke, and Swansea, and then we have Curly, whose name is white. And where is white on a color wheel? That's right, the center, symbolizing that Curly is at the center of the team, aka the leader or the captain. Going into debug mode and flying around, we can see that the paper that says that Pony Express is going under also says that Curly is getting a promotion at the very end. Now, the Q&A already explains this, but let it be known that I already had the solution written in my script. It says that the company is going under, but to finish the haul and that Curly will get a promotion. This doesn't mean he's getting a job, the company's still going under. He's getting more so of a bonus. This boils down to the company saying, look, I know that you have no reason to actually show us any loyalty since we're basically firing you and still asking you to work, but we'll give you a little extra bonus if you get this done without telling your coworkers. Something that Curly doesn't care about, choosing to tell them anyway. The only thing the Q&A mentions that I didn't have before was that the promotion also provided exceptional references. When Anya was talking about the pixel in the back of her mind, she was referring to Jimmy. Curly responds that he doesn't see it, saying that he's always looking at the bigger picture, hinting at how he overlooks Jimmy until it's too late. In fact, when going to interview Jimmy, we fall into this strange body of water, similar to the sunset scene we see from the TV. And we see these warning signs popping up with ladders sticking out of the ground, with the ladders representing the conversation that we have with Jimmy, and the warning signs being the literal warning signs that Jimmy is giving off, that Curly ignores, leading to him walking into the sun, representing the burning pain he's going to experience. It's his inaction that allowed this to happen. But there's more to it than just that. Jimmy was a longtime friend of Curly. He was someone he trusted, someone he had a history with. And now it's all come crashing down. They could have made his character confront Jimmy, failed to stop him, but they didn't. Instead, Curly thinks he can fix all this, which is very real. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's how you can hold multiple views that go against each other. It's how toxic relationships can exist. Rationalizing how someone so horrible must still care about you. It causes conflict avoidance, decision paralysis, as well as feelings of guilt, shame. It's used by narcissists as a way to get what they want. It's why Jimmy says that Curly will be remembered for this once he realizes that Curly hasn't processed it. He knows he can still control him. Curly needed time. Jimmy knew that, so he didn't allow him to have any. But eventually, it does catch up to him. I think it's here, right before the crash, in this moment, when he says, "Jim, tell me you didn't. I didn't, what the did you do?" In this moment, he breaks free. The last thing you're able to do is get into the pilot seat, but it's too late. Curly let Anya down. Jimmy made sure of it. How Fish Are Made is another game created by Wrong Organ, and an update was made that recently added some new content, with dialogue that was confirmed to be canon by the Q&A. You know, he joined because of me. What were the words I used? All right. It's a great opportunity. Easy money. Just a trip or two. Someone else's words in my mouth. Hey, worked on me as well, right? Change hurts, but worse things fester for a long time. I told him as much. I tried. I really did. We're defined by our past. We're not slaves to it. We said tomorrow will be different. Today would be the last day. The last one. The last one. And then another. And another. And another. And another. He feels trapped in this toxic relationship. We said tomorrow will be different. Jimmy telling him that things will get better. That he'll change. Today would be the last day. The last one. The last one. And then another. But he never does. Curly was already ignoring the warning signs, mentioning that he was surprised with how far he's come. He knew Jimmy had problems, but he never knew how deep they went. Always hoping that they'd make it through it in the end. But not this time. Someone else's words in my mouth. Hey, worked on me as well, right? Curly hoping that this would help him, make him better. Those were Jimmy's words. And it convinced him that this could work. I can imagine them now. If only somebody gave me a chance. Then I get better. It was his hope for Jimmy. Jimmy, the co-pilot of the ship, masking his true self from both the crew and the audience, he tries to play as the captain of the stranded Tulpar. And it's only after a replay that you realize just how thin this facade really is. Here's actually a few examples of some of my favorite foreshadowing for Jimmy in the game. When giving Curly his pills, he says, you know what they say, pain is how we know we're still living. This is easily the most shocking statement that Jimmy has in the whole game, given how early it happens. I think it's the fact that it's an indie horror game that sets it up so well. We assume going in that the focus is going to be scares and not world building, so we overlook some of the weird lines as being there for the sake of being creepy. However, it's this lowered expectation that makes it so much easier for the game to trick the player into not looking deeper into what's going on until much later into the game. Also, the fact that Jimmy's okay with being forceful with Curly, but Anya isn't because Curly can't give consent. Incredible writing. I fucking hate it. There's also this interaction with Daisuke. We'll have a rad story to tell though. They might even write articles about us. We could be on TV. It'll impress the ladies too. It's subtle, but I like it. Daisuke is imagining being on Conan O'Brien. Jimmy's thinking more live PD. Or the final thing Jimmy says to the table before you play as him. For better or worse, I'm the captain now. He says this 2 months after the crash, which makes me think that he isn't declaring this for the first time, but more so he's reinforcing something that he said probably day one. Also, to play off that captain thought, if you interact with something as Jimmy, his inner dialogue is white, the same as Curly. It's 100% a coincidence, but I like to think that it's Jimmy in his head thinking that he's just like Curly. And of course, the most infamous one, sexually excited at the sight of cartoon horses. In the beginning of the game, it comes across like he's a jokester, like he likes messing with Anya, but on a replay, it's disturbing. With all the poly imagery central to a lot of Jimmy's hallucinations, it's clear what he meant by this. Also, there are a ton of things the game does to hint at the deeper meaning of poly. One example is Jimmy's ID card, which can be found inside the baseball cap of Polly, obviously reinforcing the connection between the two. There's also the first line that Jimmy says when looking at Polly. They actually sell plushes of this guy. For kids. A single period, completely changing the subtext of a sentence. Also, they have this art celebrating 50k wishlists on Steam, with Jimmy in the background. Also, in the intro scene and when being chased, we can hear baby cries whenever we see Polly. There's also the Steam badges for the game that show Polly mutating into the creatures from Jimmy's hallucination, with the level 1 to 5 badges being named after the corresponding growth stages, going from unfertilized egg to an embryo. The final foil badge, responsibility, taking the position after the embryo, where the term fetus would normally go, the final descriptor before birth. There's also an ad for the game that shows Polly behind Anya during the scene when she says she's pregnant, as well as the color of their name that I mentioned beforehand, with both of them being cyan. Something that you might not notice on a first playthrough is just how manipulative Jimmy is throughout the whole game. Like during the party scene, where at first it may seem like he's making sense, but if you're paying attention, he really isn't. He starts hating on Curly because he wanted to leave his job and now the company is going under. implying that Curly's happy to lose his job just because he doesn't want his job anymore. But that's not how that works. I mean, how many people want to quit their jobs? And now out of those people, how many of them would be happy if their job went under? I'm guessing not a lot. Just because Curly hates his job doesn't mean he won't be impacted by this. Then Jimmy moves on to his main argument, being that the reason Curly doesn't leave his job is because he would feel bad abandoning the crew. How is that a bad thing? Like, genuinely, how does this make Curly look bad here? He cares about his crew, like what? I think the only reason that anyone ever believes this is by him being the most active and loudest talker. He controls the conversation, and it's not the only time he does this. This is the scene I mentioned earlier with Curly. Here, Jimmy spends the entire conversation just hammering away at the point that this is going to ruin Curly's reputation. He isn't listening to Curly, he's just telling him that this is all his fault. Curly's clearly just struggling with the cognitive dissonance of learning that his friend did something so awful. Trying to understand it all while Jimmy's hitting him with these calculated attacks. You were supposed to be the one who had everything under control. You said so yourself. Jimmy knows that his friend is in a panic state, and he knows how to hurt him. All because Jimmy can't take responsibility for what he did. So he has to shift blame. His terrible actions can never be his own. It must have been someone else. When picking up the gun for the first time, this happens. There are two ways to look at Curly's laugh. Either it didn't happen, and it's a sign from the devs that this is all in his head, or it did happen, and it's the final thing to make Jimmy snap and start to hallucinate. It's up in the air. Either it's a result of the insanity, or just another cause of it. It's at this point, though, that we know that Jimmy has gone off the deep end, eventually resulting in him taking Curly to the center table and cutting off his leg. Where Jimmy also imagines everyone at the table calling him captain. Now, there's a chance I missed this, but I don't think at any moment in the entire game does Anya ever call Jimmy captain. He was called captain by Swansea, but always in a sarcastic way, and Daisuke, which, well, to be fair, it is Daisuke, but never by Anya. Just another power play by him. He has to be the one in control. Then he starts to cut Curly's leg off with this loud static representing Curly screaming, but Jimmy's mind is blocking it out until it becomes too hard to ignore and we start to hear his screams through the static. Then we cut to the take responsibility scene for Daisuke, where we see Swansea's keys over the vent, Jimmy getting those keys representing the moment that Daisuke's end was sealed. Inside the vent we can see a reference back to the game board with Daisuke's piece falling over on the ground and Jimmy on top. Also, notice how large the vents are. He's watered down his suffering, imagining that this is what Daisuke went through and that it wasn't that bad. Then we get to the point where we have to walk backwards, where if you turn around, you start to see the face of Daisuke and need to restart. Jimmy not being able to face what he's done. We even walk over a memorial of Daisuke, looking at it being too much for Jimmy. Then this sequence ends with us literally walking away from responsibility. However, from this point on, it doesn't stop. Jimmy keeps having visions of Daisuke, haunted by what's happened to him. When we get to the next vent sequence, we can see his flower, and, landing in utility, Daisuke's head is inside all of the cryopods, like he can't stop thinking about it. And there was foreshadowing for this. Daisuke's grave saying Semper Desiderarii, meaning never forgotten in Latin, alluding to how Jimmy can't get the thought of his death out of his mind. Of course he can't, because Daisuke is the only person he can't make up an excuse for. During the party scene, he points out that everyone has problems with their life, except for Daisuke. Daisuke's got mommy and daddy, so he'll be fine. His own twisted mind, unable to rationalize it. He can't come up with an excuse to help him sleep at night. Unlike Swansea, who he can pick up a reason for. We then get to Curly's, where we have the whole leg scene, which when we get out of this, we can see that the plate is empty, so we know for a fact that it was eaten. However, it's the next scene I want to talk about, specifically the scene where we see Curly burning. We have Curly telling him that in the end, Jimmy will get everything that he wanted, and that Curly will take responsibility for not stopping all of this. Because Jimmy doesn't want to take the blame for what he did. He'll get exactly what he wanted. Jimmy will be the hero, and Curly the villain. Then it hits him. In that moment, seeing this imagined version of Curly saying that he'll be the villain, it was then that he realizes that this, all of it, turns Curly, in his mind, still his friend that he always looked up to, that he always relied on, into the villain of his story. And Jimmy just can't have that. So he has to change it. Not by actually taking responsibility and realizing that he's the villain, no. Instead, simply declaring that they're both heroes. Unable to take responsibility. Interestingly, take responsibility always appears in red text. And going back to color theory for a moment, Jimmy is green, which means on the color wheel, Jimmy is the furthest point away from responsibility, being on the literal opposite side. Then we get the take responsibility scene with Polly, where if you didn't notice, you were literally dodging responsibility. In the end, talking to Polly and giving an awful speech about how he's taking responsibility. Talking to himself, saying that he's made mistakes, but that he's sorry. Polly, his own mind, agreeing with Jimmy. Then, something changes. I can still make this right. Our worst moments don't make us... This, instantly snapping him out of the hallucination. Jimmy, referencing back to Anya's line, causes Polly, his subconscious, to ask him why he thinks Curly was the only one he hurt. It's not just him, but her, Anya, and that's all she gets. The person who has suffered so much because of him is shown no respect in the end, as if he ever did before. Every time she asks for help with Curly, he always has to talk down to her, over and over again, until she just caves and just agrees to do it herself, only for him to turn around and say he'll do it, proving that it had nothing to do with helping Curly, but it was all about the control and wanting to prove that he wouldn't listen to her. Using the mouthwash as disinfectant the moment Anya can't stop him, something that she said would be pointless, proving that he never respected a single thing she ever said, or just never listened. Even when she's laid out on the ground, he doesn't react. Oh, but he just can't stand to look at Daisuke's blood in the vent anymore, as if there isn't a body right across from him. It's also after her death that we get the cargo hold scene with the horse covered in maggots, showing that at the very least he's aware of the death of the child, but not at all of Anya. The only dash of acknowledgement for what he did being at the very end, where his subconscious tells him for but a moment that there's someone else besides Curly. That thought exiting his mind the moment it entered. And we cut to 0 hours before judgment. 0 hours before judgment. That's how he sees this whole thing. Believing that his self-sacrifice will be enough to justify all his actions. Also believing that his previous actions happened before judgment, so they don't count in his mind. In his world, only this individual moment defines him. Sorry to break the news to you, Jimmy, but if our worst moments don't make us monsters, that doesn't mean that your best moment makes you a hero. And trust me, this is the best one you'll ever make. And the worst thing of all, after all of this, in the end, he still sees himself as the hero. Despite this being his best moment, it's still not enough. If anyone, you deserved an ending worse than that. Anya was a tragedy. In the end, not allowing others to decide how she would live or die. Daisuke was a risk. The last ray of sunshine on that ship. His death marked a turning point for everything. Swansea was an uncertainty. His final moments, viewed in the eyes of a villain, but not controlled. Jimmy was a monster. The root cause of all this suffering. Toxic friendship that should have ended long ago. Curly was